Well, hi everyone, and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today we're going to talk about the anniversary of the release of Pet Sounds, a very controversial album in its time, and now a very widely lauded album. Some even say that it's the best of all time. And the question to all of these questions is not only why, but more importantly, what did Pet Sounds represent in 1966 when it was released? Well, to sum it up, it was the first album marketed and consumed by rock and roll audiences that was not discernibly rock and roll. By the mid 60s, rock and roll was still very much based on R&B, a primarily Black American music format pioneered by artists who themselves were influenced by a combination of blues and gospel, and with a slightly sped up rhythm, that famous backbeat, it became rock and roll. Chuck Berry, arguably the inventor of rock and roll as opposed to more traditional R&B from whence it was derived, even described the meaning and the definitions of rock and roll in a song surprisingly called Rock and Roll Music. And it was these artists, along with blues artists, that influenced all of the white rock and roll bands of the early 60s, including those from the UK, like the Beatles, Stones, Kinks, The Who. The list goes on. Now, the Beach Boys were a harmony group, essentially. They were, before Pet Sounds, essentially what was a white doo-wop group, where the essence of the musical magic, if you will, came from harmonizing and the use of vocalizing to create rhythm. This also was a form of art invented by Black Americans, and doo-wop was, of course, very much intertwined with R&B. You could call it a subgenre of R&B. While Pet Sounds featured classic Beach Boys harmony, everything else had changed. The harmony of the music, the melody in the music, the rhythm in the music, the arrangements of the music, the very composition of the music was very, very different, owing much more to European classical music, both the Baroque tradition and the very different Romantic tradition, than it did to blues or R&B. Some of those influences were still there, to be sure, but very, very diminished. For instance, possibly the most well-known song from the album, God Only Knows, sung by Carl Wilson on lead vocals, the melody line to that is played on the French horn, which introduces the song, is very, very similar to the overture to Wagner's opera Rienzi. And so much of it has very Baroque keyboards, very Baroque chordal and harmonic arrangements and composition and compositional features. And the instruments used, layers of things like harmonium, accordion, organ, all of these things hinted at something very different than the typical instruments you'd associate with rock and roll, which were electric guitar, piano, bass, either electric or acoustic, but by this time increasingly electric, and a basic drum set, not very different than a drum set you'd see in a blues or a jazz combo. So, was Pet Sounds a great rock and roll album? No, because I would argue that it wasn't a rock and roll album at all. It was something else. Experimental pop could be a way to describe it, whilst this term sort of grates on me because it's been used and misapplied. You could call it Baroque pop, you could call it classical inspired pop music, you could perhaps call it progressive rock, because, in Frank Zappa's words, progressive rock is rock that doesn't sound like other rock. And that's exactly what Pet Sounds was. And audiences at the time weirdly understood this a bit more than the critics who have heaped praise on Pet Sounds later on, because they didn't buy it. Now, the reason that they didn't buy it as much as they bought previous Beach Boys albums was because it was so different. The Beach Boys before Pet Sounds were frankly typecast as a white doo-wop band that featured surfing and other California motifs in terms of the thematic and lyrical content of the music. Even the arrangements, the so-called sound of the surf organ and surf guitar were kind of present in pre-Pet Sounds Beach Boys. And this even drove a wedge between Brian Wilson, the compositional mastermind of Pet Sounds, and the other brothers and other members of the group. Now, was Pet Sounds a great album? Absolutely yes. What I'm saying doesn't contradict that. It's one of the finest albums of the 60s, one of the finest albums of all time. But it was jarring to audiences who had grown accustomed to buying the Beach Boys to hear a traditional rock and roll sound. Imagine, for instance, buying a Van Halen album and they're playing ska. It might be a great ska album, but people might not necessarily like it. Imagine if Herbie Hancock released a punk rock album. Imagine if Dean Martin did a cover, an album with Led Zeppelin covers sung in the style of Robert Plant. It would be jarring to the audiences that were used to this. And so that was a factor. And another factor was how melancholic the album is. Now, I've said myself that some of the Frank Sinatra albums that have stood the test of time the best are his more melancholic albums, albums like Sinatra and Strings, September of My Years, things like that. But in all of those albums, Sinatra and his clever arrangers, his very talented arrangers, made sure to resolve the melancholic themes on a positive note. There was always some level of hope, even in the darker albums of Sinatra, where Pet Sounds, whilst very romantic, there was also a sadness to it, an unresolved sadness to it. Questions about loss communicated through the lyrics, questions about almost mournful attributes of the music. And this was also jarring to fans who were expecting a Beach Boys album that was typical of the themes and the music that went along with it, that was all about optimism. Let's drive a fast car. Let's go to the beach. Let's cheer on the team. Let's have a good time with the girls, all of this sort of stuff. And so Brian Wilson did something very risky, and it changed the band forever. The band never had as much commercial success after as it did before, and personal problems began to tear the band apart, although they continued to record really good material into the late 60s and well into the late 70s. But Pet Sounds was a milestone, even though it had a kind of lukewarm reception. Critics did love it, and fellow musicians loved it. There may not have been a Sgt. Pepper without it. Paul McCartney kind of sort of said so himself. You could say the same about other more classically inclined so-called rock and roll albums, things like Procol Harum's first album, things like Days of Future Past by the Moody Blues. So what does this mean? Well, the ultimate legacy of Pet Sounds is almost taking the rock and roll out of rock and roll music, which is why the term after Pet Sounds, rock, increasingly supplanted rock and roll. And rock just came to mean popular music made for young people that was generally louder and more aggressive than the traditional pop music, which was still more song based rather than performance based, as rock and roll or rock would become. So many things changed because of Pet Sounds. It's a very, very fascinating album. It's an album that immediately captures your attention because it didn't sound like anything before it. And because of the uniqueness of the arrangements and the unique ways that Brian used studio techniques to his advantage, no one could quite replicate it, even though its influence was really, really huge. So if you haven't heard Pet Sounds, check it out today. And otherwise, well, remember it fondly. Like, subscribe. We will see you next time. Take care.